We move on now to the 21st study here at the Californian Camp 1983. And this is now at the 3 o'clock hour on Thursday afternoon. We turn back now to our book Desire of Ages to continue our consideration of the life of Jesus Christ. And the strong point which emerges from the present point of study is the way in which Christ made no attempt at all to get himself established, but quietly and patiently waited day by day for God to unfold his plans for him. And this illustrates and supports the principle laid down on page 208, page 208 in the book Desire of Ages. We read this before, we read it again too before we're finished. It's the fifth last line on the last full paragraph on the page, which is the second full paragraph on the page. So it's staying at the very end of that particular line. So utterly was Christ emptied of self, and he made no plans for himself. He accepted God's plans for him, and day by day the Father unfolded his plans. Now I appreciate very much the word unfolded as we think in terms of these early days of Christ's ministry, after his baptism and after he had returned from the temptations on the mountain. And it's evident that Jesus Christ simply came to the Jordan River, silently listened to the preaching of John the Baptist. And when John said to the delegation from the Pharisees that amongst you is the Messiah, Christ made no attempt at all to step in and announce himself, but waited for God to unfold the future for him day by day. It wasn't unfolding, and Christ followed on as successive orders came to him as the days went by. We've now moved down on page 138 to the calling of the first apostles. We just touched that when the time ran out in our last study period. We'll now do this more thoroughly. We read now the paragraph which says, leaving John, they went to seek Jesus. One of them was Andrew, the brother of Simon. The other was John the evangelist. These were Christ's first disciples. Moved by an irresistible impulse, they followed Jesus, anxious to speak with him, yet awed and silent, lost in the overwhelming significance of the thought, is this the Messiah? Jesus knew that the disciples were following him. They were the first fruits of his ministry, and there was joy in the heart of the divine teacher as these souls responded to his grace. Yet turning, he asked only, what seek ye? He would leave them free to turn back or to speak of their desire. Now, is this a common attitude on Christ's part to seemingly discourage folk from following him? Is it? It is really. Seemingly, I say. Christ never really discourages a follower, but seemingly Christ discouraged them from coming, just as when he later was walking with those men to Emmaus after his crucifixion and resurrection, and they said to him, come stay with us tonight. What did Jesus Christ seemingly do? Discourage them. He seemed to pass on, and they had to actually urge his presence on them before he would consent to come in. And we need to appreciate the fact that God in his great humility is anxious never to impose his presence where it is not desired, and that's why it's quite important for us to make it clear in our prayers that we really do want the presence of God. And I'm learning, and I'm sure you folk are too, that the more positively we plead for Christ's presence in these camp meetings, the more certain and sure that presence is amongst us. Whereas we just take it for granted that God's going to come in amongst us and don't make any special effort in prayer, we find ourselves destitute of the divine presence. So different, of course, from the proselyting efforts of churches today, who do their level best to plead, cajole, urge, even terrify people to come and join their congregations. So we need to recognize that our policies and practices need to be those of Jesus Christ, not of those who are trying to build vast movements at the present time. I read on now. Of one purpose only were they conscious. One presence filled their thought. They exclaimed, Rabbi, where dwellest thou? In a brief interview by the wayside, they could not receive that for which they longed. They desired to be alone with Jesus, to sit at his feet and hear his words. He saith unto them, Come and see. And they came and saw where he dwelt and abode with him that day. That's a very interesting statement, because I wonder where Christ did abide that day. Bethbara, as we know from the description given in the Word of God, was just by Jericho and almost down to the Dead Sea, well south of Nazareth, where Christ had previously been brought up. Now, where was Nazareth? In what province? Galilee. And that was way up north, wasn't it? Way beyond Samaria. So it was at the opposite end of the land, a place where Christ had never been before. So one would suspect that there was no friends down there. One would suspect that from the geographical location of it. But at the same time, and Christ being a penniless wanderer, I hardly see him hiring a room at an inn, so I wonder just where he dwelt. One very strong possibility, of course, is the fact that, as you read previously, Christ must have made a lot of friends during his youth and young manhood through the ministry of love and self-sacrifice which he'd extended toward many people. And it's quite possible that one of these folk who had received his blessed ministry up in the north had migrated to the south and had been the means of God providing Christ with a dwelling place during the short stay down there at the Jordan River. And it was a fairly short stay, because he seemed to be there for several days, after which we find he went right up north to Cana. So the next several pages deal with the way in which John and Andrew went out and called others, Philip being one of them, Nathaniel being another one. I would like you to notice and make a reference of the paragraph on page 139, which says, the third paragraph, it is contrition and faith and love which enable the soul to receive wisdom from heaven. Faith, working by love, is the key of knowledge, and everyone that loveth knoweth God. Faith, working by love, is the key of knowledge. And without that key of knowledge, how much truth can you really learn? None whatsoever. None whatsoever. You may have all kinds of facts in your mind about the Bible, but when it comes to real truth, you will have none of it. You'll be blind to what the Bible actually teaches without that key of knowledge. And that key of knowledge, of course, is faith that works by love and purifies the soul. Now, just passing fairly briefly over the remaining pages of this chapter, which deal not with the mission of Christ so much now as the effect of that mission, we find that the way in which the mission of Christ grew was that Christ called, or Christ didn't call really, he drew two men who were Andrew and John, and they talked with him for one evening in his little dwelling place, wherever that dwelling place was. And they in turn went out and invited their relatives and friends to come and share with them the glory of what they had found in the person of Jesus Christ. And so Christ's work began to develop, or it began to lay its foundations, not by posting billboards around about the place and calling a great public meeting and handing out little sign your name and give me your address papers and so forth, but by quietly moving from person to person to person. And how has this movement been built? Same way precisely, which to me is a very encouraging feature of it. I'm glad that we don't have to go banging from door to door. That to me is one of the most distasteful occupations you'd ever name. Some people love it, but I didn't. You don't either? I guess most of us don't, because you mostly get a lot of rebuffs, and as we learned back in the Sabbath rest principle, generally speaking, it's quite a waste of time, because we're at the wrong place at the wrong time. And so the work began to develop, and the foundations were laid for the ministry of Jesus. Now then, we now come to the next chapter, which is an extremely significant one, filled with very, very delightful information, inspiring information, and it is called At the Marriage Feast. And this marriage feast was at Cana in Galilee. Now, if we draw a quick sketch on the board today of the land of Palestine, we can better appreciate the movements of Jesus Christ during this period of time. Here's a shoreline of Palestine with the Nile Delta down here, Of course, the simple geography with the Sea of Galilee, and down south we have the Dead Sea. Here is Judea, here is Samaria, and here is Galilee. Now, the baptism of Jesus Christ, I guess that boy should be a little bit taller up there, higher up there, and not so far south. Now, the baptism of Christ took place at Beth Abara, or Beth Abra, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, which was located roughly about there. That's roughly about there. Now, having gathered to himself these several disciples, Andrew and John, Nathaniel and Philip, and was there any more? Was there Peter as well? James, right? Half a dozen, probably 4 or 5 to half a dozen young men, without working any recorded miracle, without preaching any particular sermon. Jesus Christ then trudges with his disciples all the way up to Cana in Galilee, which was somewhere about there, not too far from Capernaum. An insignificant little town that was hardly more than a village. He attended there a marriage feast, and almost immediately thereafter he turns around again and comes back down to the Passover, where he drove out the money changers and the flocks and the herds and the birds and so forth, which were making such a din and profaning the sanctuary environment. Now, if then Christ left this area to walk all the way to Cana to make water into wine and came back to Jerusalem again without performing any other significant miracles, or as far as the record goes, preaching any sermons, then that visit to Cana must have been a very important one, must not? Otherwise, why make the trip all the way up there, to come all the way back again, to do just one little miracle in the meantime in Cana of Galilee? It obviously means there must be something significant about the marriage feast at Cana. Otherwise, why didn't Jesus just remain down in the south until the Passover came and then drive out the money changers and the money lenders? Now, you'll notice on page 144, the very first sentence says, Jesus did not begin his ministry by some great work before the Sanhedrin at Jerusalem. At a household gathering in a little Galilean village, his power was put forth to add to the joy of a wedding feast. Now, come across to page, the very next chapter, and first of all is quoted the verse which says, after this, now after what? The marriage feast, he went down to Capernaum, he and his mother and his brethren and his disciples, and they continued there not many days. That's what it says. It says nothing about there being any miracle working power going on. This says nothing about his preaching and his sermons. It just says they went down to Capernaum and continued there not many days. And the Jews' Passover was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Actually went down to Jerusalem, of course, according to our terminology today. Now across to page 161. In the cleansing of the temple, Jesus was announcing his mission as the Messiah and entering upon his work. Now this then seems to be slightly contradictory, because back on page 144 it plainly says Christ began his ministry at the marriage feast of Cana of Galilee. Page 161, he entered upon his work at the cleansing of the temple. So does it seem he had two starts? So it seems, doesn't it? There's the apparent contradiction between these two things. Well, it's different words, sure, but a different kind of work. Well, yes, it was, but it says back on page 144, he began his ministry. On page 161, he announced his mission, now and began his work, entered upon his work. Now, his ministry, of course, was his work, and so I'm not quite certain what distinction to make between these two, because the marriage feast was an extremely significant act on Christ's part, and was certainly very much the announcement of his mission in a certain very specific sense. But likewise, so was the cleansing of the temple at Jerusalem. Now, one was a very private affair, and the other a very public affair. And that, of course, is the major difference between these two. One involved a cleansing and an infilling, because when he cleansed that temple, he then filled the empty space with his own presence, and peace took the place of the din and the commotion. and health and healing and life took the place of death and destruction. In any case, without going into that part too much for the moment, let's come back to the marriage feast at Cana of Galilee. And I think it is extremely significant that Jesus Christ began his ministry, I'll just quote the exact words so we don't get confusion here, that Christ began his ministry at a marriage feast. At a marriage feast. Now, why should Christ, as I said before, travel all that way to Cana to be present at a marriage feast, to turn water into wine, and thereby begin his ministry? And we've long since learned, of course, that every act of Christ's life was filled with great significance. It was all symbolic. In what Christ did, there was a message. Nothing was accidental. Nothing was inconsequential. Everything was very, very important. Now, we recognize that the entire plan of salvation depends upon the marriage relationship between Christ and his people. In fact, the entire basis of God's government, the binding factor in the entire universe of God, is the marriage relationship. The first marriage being between the deity of Jesus Christ and the angelic. So Christ, before man was even created, occupied the position of God and angel, and as such was called the only begotten Son of God. Back in the study of the seed principle, of course, we spent time looking into that wonderful, wonderful illustration of God's ways of doing things. And when God made the first man upon this earth, he gave him a wife. He instituted the marriage ceremony, or the marriage relationship, I should say, and Jesus Christ himself was the minister who celebrated and blessed the first marriage back in the Garden of Eden. Now, I want now to demonstrate the next few minutes that there are quite a number of reasons why Jesus Christ had to come down and personally enter into a marriage relationship, first of all with humanity, and then that is humanity in general, as he did back in Bethlehem, and secondly, individually to marry every believer who would come and give themselves to him. I'll begin with a statement from the Great Controversy, page 427, I believe it to be. Yes, page 427 is correct. Actually, I'll go back to page 426 to lead into the information we're looking for. I'd like to read statements in their context so that you've got a much better appreciation of what the message is all about in the particular statement. And I hope that we can see as we look at the various reasons as to why it was absolutely essential for Jesus Christ to marry into humanity, why it was essential for him to do that we'll be able to understand better the reason why the marriage feast at Cana was the place where Christ began his ministry. I read now from page 426 to 427 in the book Great Controversy. In the summer and autumn of 1844, the proclamation, "Behold, the bridegroom cometh," was given. The two classes represented by the wise and foolish virgins were then developed. One class who looked with joy to the Lord's appearing and who had been diligently preparing to meet him. Another class that, influenced by fear and acting from impulse, had been satisfied with a theory of the truth, but were destitute of the grace of God. In the parable, when the bridegroom came, they that were ready went in with him to the marriage. The coming of the bridegroom here brought to view takes place before the marriage. The marriage represents the reception by Christ of his kingdom. Don't forget that point. What does the marriage represent? The reception of Christ by Christ of his kingdom. The holy city, the New Jerusalem, which is the capital and representative of the kingdom, is called the bride, the Lamb's wife. Said the angel to John, "Come hither, I will show thee the bride, the Lamb's wife." He carried me away in the spirit, said the prophet, and showed me that great city, the holy Jerusalem, descending out of heaven from God. Revelation 21, verse 9 and 10. Clearly then the bride represents the holy city, and the virgins that go out to meet the bridegroom are a symbol of the church. In the Revelation, the people of God are said to be guests at the marriage supper. If guests, they cannot be represented also as the bride. Christ, as stated by the prophet Daniel, will receive from the Ancient of Days in heaven dominion and glory and a kingdom. He will receive the New Jerusalem, the capital of his kingdom, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. Having received the kingdom, he will come in his glory as King of kings and Lord of lords for the redemption of his people, who are to sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob at his table in his kingdom to partake of the marriage supper of the Lamb. Now, in this marriage, then, who is the bride? The New Jerusalem, which is the capital of the kingdom, and therefore Christ is married to the kingdom, of which the New Jerusalem is the capital and therefore the symbol. And in this marriage, I say this marriage, who are the guests? The redeemed, right? God's people are the guests. But when you turn back to Romans chapter 7, verses 1 to 4, verse 4 in particular, we find that here is another marriage in which the people of God are not the guests, but they are the bride. Verse 4, Romans chapter 7. Wherefore, my brethren, you also are become dead to the law by the body of Christ, that you should be married to another, even to him who is raised from the dead, that we should bring forth fruit unto God. Now in this marriage, who is the bridegroom? Christ. And who is the bride? God's people are the bride. So here are two different marriages. They're both called by the same name, of course, the marriage, but they're two different marriages. One is the marriage of Christ to the individual Christian, which makes him to be a Christian, and the other, of course, is the marriage to the New Jerusalem. They're quite different from each other, but they're both essential to each other. Now, let's go back for a moment to Daniel chapter 2. Don't look it up. We know Daniel 2 off by heart almost, or we should do. The image with a head of gold, breast and arms of silver, belly and thighs of brass, legs of iron and feet part of iron, part of clay. And the great stone that was cut out of the mountain without hands, and smote the image upon the feet of it. And the image then was the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, and the clay all broken to pieces and ground to powder and became like the chaff of the summer thrashing floor. It was blown away and no place was found for it. Now, in Daniel 2, there are two mountains. The first mountain is the mountain out of which the stone is cut. Right? And that stone then comes down and strikes the image upon the feet of it, and that stone then grows into another great mountain which fills the entire earth. So in Daniel 2, there are two mountains. The one from which the stone is cut and the one into which the stone grows. Now in Bible prophecy, what does a mountain symbolize? A kingdom, right? Now, what kingdom was Jesus Christ cut out of at the beginning of the great controversy? His Father's kingdom. Into what kingdom shall he grow at the end of the great controversy? His own kingdom, right? His own kingdom. And it's the marriage to this kingdom which is spoken about in Revelation chapter 19 and referred to in Great Controversy, page 427. Now, let's go back a moment to the Great Controversy, and as we recognise, in the beginning, the organisation of God's kingdom was that God was the supreme source of all life and blessing and light, and Jesus, the Son of God, was the connector between God and man, and the creatures, which included the angels and in turn created man, were, as they still are, dependent receivers. And that was the organisation of heaven, and worked very beautifully for untold millennia, until finally there arose an angel filled with pride whose name was Lucifer, who, losing sight of the principle that he was nothing but a dependent creature, and imagining that he had in himself the power and the virtue to be a somebody, that he had the ability to be self-creative, and that he did not need to have God to supply all his wants and needs, tried to exalt himself into the very position of Jesus Christ. And this mighty angel mounted what had been up until that time the only challenge against the position of Jesus Christ. Now he charged, of course, that God and Christ were not prepared to make any sacrifice whatsoever which was to ignore the fact, of course, that Christ had made the greatest possible sacrifice. And because of this, the position of Christ became open to contention, to argument and to controversy. And what did Jesus Christ do? He stepped down from that position. He gave up the kingdom in order that he might win the kingdom back again. And so Jesus Christ came down to this earth to win back that kingdom. But now there are at least, I think, 4 or 5 different reasons why Christ had to marry into the human family in order to get that kingdom back. And the first, I don't know whether we can give these priority, but we'll mention them anyway as they come to mind, and don't regard this order as being an order of priority. I'm not quite sure which is the most important, although most likely the one which is most important is the fact that in order for Jesus Christ to win back the kingdom, he had to come into human flesh and blood in order to give a perfect and complete demonstration of God's character. That probably is the most important. So the first one we'll mention then is the fact, and we'll explain each one in turn after we list them. The first one then was that Jesus Christ had to come down into fallen, sinful, mortal human flesh and blood in order to give the required demonstration of the character of God, in order to deliver, first of all, angels and then men from Satan's deceptive philosophies. That's one reason. A second reason is this, that Christ had to partake of fallen, sinful flesh and blood in order to die for mankind. A third reason was he had to do this in order that he might give proof that the law of God can be kept by people clothed in the handicap of fallen, sinful human flesh and blood. And the fourth reason was that Jesus Christ had to marry humanity so he could give the final demonstration of God's character through the 144,000. Now there's at least 4 reasons why Christ had to come and partake of fallen, sinful human flesh and blood. Now let's enlarge each of these ones in turn, because it's only as we grasp these principles that we're able to appreciate why Jesus Christ began his ministry at a marriage feast in Cana of Galilee. That was a very significant and important act upon his part, a very symbolic act, to say the least of it. Now the first one we mentioned was the fact that Jesus Christ had to come down into fallen, sinful human flesh and blood in order to give the required demonstration of God's character. That demonstration which would successfully take away from Satan his power to deceive and mislead angels and men. Now, of course, I assume that you've all read the little book called The Living and the Dead, or you've been here to camp and heard the Seed Principle series, or both, or you've heard the tapes from that particular series, which were given, I think, about 3 years ago. So I don't propose today to re-give the full Seed Principle studies, but we will give perhaps just a quick survey of them. Now, and also, of course, the 7 angels, which is intimately connected with this same problem. Let's go back in our book, Desire of Ages, now to page 21 and 22. And that, of course, is in the very first chapter, which is entitled God with Us. We looked at that very, very briefly yesterday. And on the bottom of page 21, we find an account of how the law of life, which is self-sacrificing love, was broken in heaven by the uprising of Lucifer. And the statement says, as we go across the page, in heaven itself this law was broken. Sin originated in self-seeking. Lucifer, the covering cherub, desired to be first in heaven. He sought to gain control of heavenly beings, to draw them away from their Creator, and to win their homage to himself. Now that was Satan's objective. His objective was to replace Jesus Christ with himself, not God the Father. He recognized he couldn't take God's place. That wasn't the basis of controversy. God's position has never been the subject of controversy. The position of Christ is the subject of controversy and contention. Note the statement, for instance, from the Bible Commentary, Volume 7, page 973, which reads as follows: He, Satan, declares he cannot submit to be under Christ's command, that God's commands alone will he obey. So Satan said, God, yes, I'll obey him. but Christ, never. Now that, of course, is not a feasible proposition, because if you won't obey Jesus Christ, who is God's spokesman, then you can't obey God, because Christ is the Word of God. So if you're obeying God, you have to obey Christ. And if you're obeying Christ, then you're obeying God. If you disobey Christ, then who do you disobey? You disobey God. So that was not a feasible proposition that Satan propounded. But in his mind it was, because brilliant though he had been, his wisdom was corrupted because of his brightness, and he is no longer able to think straight and clearly. Now, in order to achieve a desired objective, you must have a method. And that method is now outlined for us in the next few words. Therefore, he misrepresented God, attributing to him the desire for self-exaltation. With his own evil characteristics, he sought to invest the loving Creator. So what was Satan's method? The misrepresentation of God's character. Thus he deceived angels, thus he deceived men. He led them to doubt the word of God and to distrust his goodness, because God is a God of justice and terrible majesty. Satan caused them to look upon him as severe and unforgiving. Thus he drew men to join him in rebellion against God, and the night of woe settled down upon the world. So Satan enjoyed success as a result of this, the application of this particular device. Success which resulted, of course, in rebellion. It's a very interesting fact that rebellion is always the fruit of a misrepresentation of God's character. Even Satan himself did not rebel against God until he came to the place where he formed in his own mind a misrepresentation of God's character. Let's just briefly review Satan's history in this regard. And of course, excellent source material for this is found in Jones's book, The Spirit of the Papacy, as well as the chapter in Patriarchs and Prophets called Why Was Sin Permitted? And in great controversy, the chapter called The Origin of Evil. Now, Satan, first of all, was a glorious and very, very wonderful angel, a beautiful angel who stood highest amongst all the angels. He stood nearest to God. He dwelt continually in Christ's very presence, and no doubt Christ was very much a companion to him. But there came a time when pride developed in Lucifer, but not yet rebellion. Not yet. When pride developed, then he saw himself as being better than he really was, because that's what pride does to you. It gives you an inflated opinion of yourself. And understanding at that time, as he certainly did, that God assigned positions on the basis of qualification, not on the basis of any kind of favoritism or such like, he expected that God would promote him to where he thought he ought to be. And so he patiently, at first, and then with increasing impatience, waited for God to do what he expected him to do. Now, there's no rebellion yet, no trace of it yet. He still trusted God and still believed in God. But when time went by and God did not give him the expected promotion, then he asked the question, why not? There's something wrong. And there was something wrong, but where was there something wrong? Right, in Lucifer's own mind. But in his own mind, he didn't see it there. He thought the trouble was with God, not with him. And so he began then to surmise and to conjecture as to what the real problem might be. And increasingly, of course, he gave the blame to God until finally he came to believe that God was a liar, that God was showing favoritism to Jesus Christ, that God was not honest, that God was in fact an oppressor, that God had placed a limit upon the development and he had reached that limit. Now that is when Satan formed a wrong concept of God's character, and what followed immediately? He then determined to go out and get for himself what he thought God should have given to him. And what is that? Rebellion. So where did rebellion begin? Where the misconception of God's character began. And where will rebellion end? When God's character has been correctly put back into its rightful place. So therefore, the only way in which to get rid of rebellion, and therefore sin throughout the universe, is to get rid of the misrepresentation of God's character. And who alone can do that work? only Jesus Christ, as this next paragraph tells us. The earth was dark through misapprehension of God. The earth was dark, the statement says, and then it tells you why it was dark or how it was dark through misapprehension of God. That the gloomy shadows might be lightened, that the world might be brought back to God, Satan's deceptive power was to be broken. And note very carefully, the statement does not say that the gloomy shadows might be lightened, that the world might be brought back to God. Jesus had to die for fallen man. Does it say that? No, it doesn't. It says Satan's deceptive power is to be broken. This could not be done by force. The exercise of force is contrary to the principles of God's government. He desires only the service of love, and love cannot be commanded. It cannot be won by force or authority. Only by love is love awakened. To know God is to love him. His character must be manifested in contrast to the character of Satan. Now, there's the key sentence in this particular paragraph. And it is that God's character must be manifested, which is much more than a mere declaration. A declaration, of course, is a statement in words, but a manifestation is a revelation, is something seen rather than merely heard. Now, what are the next three words? In contrast to the character of Satan. Now, to show something in contrast, what must you do with it? You must place it side by side, right? You must place it side by side. Now, we could hope, we'd like to hope, although of course it's pointless to hope, that up in heaven, Christ could have given this demonstration or provided this manifestation of the character of God in contrast to the character of Satan before Satan even left the courts of heaven. But that was not possible. It was not possible because at that time the character of Satan was only in its infancy. It was just a seed or just barely springing up, and by no means had yet come to maturity. And that character had to come to full maturity before Christ could come down and give the contrasting revelation of his character, also at full maturity. And the two at Christ's character at his best and Satan at his worst had to be shown side by side, where Satan would be manifest at his worst. And does Satan show his character at his worst up in heaven? No, he didn't. He was down upon this earth. And it was in fallen, sinful, human flesh and blood that Satan gave that fully mature manifestation of his character. So then where did Christ have to give the full manifestation of God's character? In that same fallen, sinful, mortal human flesh and blood, at the time when sin had reached its height in that fallen, sinful flesh and blood. Now you may say to me, well, didn't that happen back at the flood? In a certain limited sense, yes, but only in a certain limited sense. It is true that sin as such had been practiced to its wickedest end before the flood. The thoughts of men's hearts were only evil continually, but the effects of sin upon the human organism had as yet been barely manifested. Now, how long after creation was the flood, or after the fall was the flood? Remember? 1656 to be exact, 1656 years after the flood, after the fall of man. Now, I read a statement once, I'd like to find it again, I just don't know where it is right offhand, where Sister White says that so great was the vitality enjoyed by the folk before the flood that it took 2.5 millennia before the effects of sin began to appear in broken health and disease. 2.5 millennia. Which means not until after the flood did sickness really begin to manifest itself amongst the human family. So the effects of sin upon mankind were not fully manifest before the flood, even though sin itself had reached its height. But when you come to the fullness of time, when Christ appeared upon this earth, what then about the effects of sin upon the human organism? It was fully manifested. Christ came into a world where everybody seemed to be sick, didn't they? Every day, thousands of cripples and blind and halt and maimed and lepers and so forth crowded upon him every day, it seemed. And he seemed to spend nearly all his time healing all these desperate cases. So most certainly by the time Christ came to this earth, the effects of sin in depraving mankind physically, mentally and spiritually had become very manifest. And of course, we know that demon possession during the time of Christ's earthly sojourn was a very, very serious problem. Now, if Jesus Christ had come to this earth just to save mankind from sin, to die, if the only task he had to do is to die for our sins, as most theologies propose, then why did Christ wait for 4,000 years of human misery to pass by before coming to die for man's sins? The reason was, of course, that he had to wait until wickedness had reached its height because of a need to give a contrasting revelation of God's character side by side with the character of Satan. Now, on page 36 and 37 of Desire of Ages, those statements I have read to you previously, I won't read them again today, excepting perhaps for the first sentence on page 36, or paragraph 3 on page 36. The deception of sin had reached its height. All the agencies for depraving the souls of men had been put in operation. That's the situation in Christ's day. Next page, top of the page. Sin had become a science and vice was consecrated as a part of religion. Rebellion had struck its roots deep into the heart, and the hostility of man was most violent against heaven. It was demonstrated before the universe that, apart from God, humanity could not be uplifted. A new element of life and power must be imparted by him who made the world. So that was the situation when Jesus Christ arrived after 4,000 years of sin and came to this earth specifically to give a demonstration of God's character in contrast to the character of Satan. Now the point was that Christ could not come down and do this as an angel. He could not come down and do it as a God. He had to come and do it as a man. And as what kind of man? The same kind of man, fallen, sinful, human and mortal as that in which Satan was manifesting his character at the same point of time. Thus, at the same place, Christ's manifestation of God's character at his very best served to expose Satan's character at his very worst. And the angels of God up in heaven, of course, were able to see the difference, and they were forever cured of any questions or doubts or sympathies for Satan at that point of time. Again, I shan't read those statements. They're over on page 759, page 761 in the same book, Desire of Ages. We read them back in the seven angels presentation and also in the seed principle presentation as well. So then this was the first reason as to why Jesus Christ had to become married to the human family, into humanity, and it was, of course, a very significant and important reason. Naturally, in that situation or condition, he was very, very separated from the awesome might and power he had as God, as a creator God, up in heaven above. And that's why in the story of the stilling of the tempest, I'll just find the page very quickly, is page 338 in the book Desire of Ages, and there's 336 in the book Desire of Ages. There, Sister White says that when Jesus was awakened to meet the storm, he was in perfect peace. There was no trace of fear in word or look, for no fear was in his heart. But he rested not in the possession of almighty power. It was not as the master of earth and sea and sky that he reposed in quiet. That power he had laid down, and he says, I can of mine own self do nothing. He trusted in the Father's might. It was in faith in God's love and care that Jesus rested, and the power of that word which stilled the storm was the power of God. In other words, Christ was divorced at this point of time from his deity, and therefore he was divorced from the kingdom, and therefore he had to go through these progressive marriages to recover that kingdom and again possess the heavens and the earth and be king of the universe from the New Jerusalem. Well, that's our time gone again, so I'll have to stop at this point, and we'll pick it up again when we come back in just a few minutes. The time now is